23 June 1942. Wind lashes across a Welsh airfield, sharp with the smell of wet grass and hot oil. An unfamiliar engine note fades into silence. Metal ticks as it cools. Allied pilots stand motionless, boots sinking into the turf, eyes locked on the shape in front of them. The aircraft's skin is scarred but intact. Its nose still warm. Someone runs a hand along the wing root and feels the vibration fade from the metal. Another pilot exhales, slow and disbelieving. This machine should not be here. Not intact. Not captured. And yet it sits before them, solid and real, carrying the weight of every man who has tried, and failed, to outrun it. For months, Allied fighter pilots had spoken its name with frustration and anger. Focke Wulf 190. The German fighter that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike hard, and vanish straight down, beyond pursuit. In the air, it had humiliated experienced Spitfire squadrons. In the dive, it simply fell away, faster than instincts, faster than courage. Now, for the first time, it could be touched. The aircraft had landed by mistake. Oberleutnant Armin Faber, disoriented after combat over southern England, followed the wrong coastline and put his Fw-190A-3 down at RAF Pembrey, believing it to be a Luftwaffe base. British ground crews rushed the field before he could destroy it. Within hours, the fighter was guarded, dismantled, and quietly prepared for the journey that mattered most. When it arrived at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, the mood was tense, almost reverent. Engineers moved slowly, deliberately. Pilots circled the aircraft like surgeons before an operation. They noted the broad wings, the tight cowling around the BMW 801 radial engine, the thick, armored windscreen. This was not a fragile interceptor. This was a weapon built to survive violence. Then came the test flights. The first dives were cautious. Throttle back. Nose down. Airspeed climbing. Control forces stiffening. The needle swept past figures that Spitfire pilots associated with danger. Compressibility tremors that plagued other fighters at high speed simply did not arrive. The Fw-190 stayed solid. Stable. Obedient. When the calculations were done, the numbers forced silence across the room. In a clean dive, the aircraft could pass 700 km per hour without losing control. Without structural failure. Without fear. For Allied pilots who had watched German fighters disappear beneath them in combat, this was not just data. It was confirmation of a nightmare they had already lived, and now the question hung heavy in the air at Farnborough. If the enemy had been diving away with this advantage all along, what else had they been hiding inside this machine? By the time the engineers finished their first measurements, the urgency was unmistakable. This aircraft had not appeared suddenly in 1942. It had been shaping the air war for nearly a year, quietly rewriting the balance over the Channel while Allied command struggled to understand why familiar tactics no longer worked. The first encounters had come in late summer of 1941. RAF pilots flying Spitfire MKV variants reported a new German fighter over northern France. It climbed faster, rolled quicker, and when attacked, it did not turn to fight. It dropped its nose and vanished straight down. Reports described the same pattern again and again: a brief exchange, a flash of cannon fire, then the German aircraft accelerating away in a steep dive no Spitfire could safely follow. At Fighter Command Headquarters, these reports piled up with uncomfortable consistency. Pilots were not exaggerating. Loss ratios told the story clearly. Units that had dominated the skies during the Battle of Britain were now struggling to hold parity. Morale began to erode, not from fear, but from helplessness. At Farnborough, the captured Fw-190 was stripped and examined with clinical precision. Engineers documented everything. The wing loading. The aileron balance. The robust landing gear designed for rough forward airstrips. But attention kept returning to the engine installation. The BMW 801 radial was compact, heavily armored, and mated to an efficient cooling system that allowed sustained high-speed descents without overheating. Unlike liquid-cooled engines vulnerable to sudden pressure changes and battle damage, this one seemed built to endure punishment. The control surfaces told another story. At high speeds, many Allied fighters suffered from heavy stick forces and compressibility effects that robbed pilots of control authority. The FW-190's ailerons, however, remained responsive deep into the dive. This was not accidental. German engineers had prioritized roll rate and structural integrity, understanding that survival often depended on disengagement rather than turning combat. Test pilots compared notes carefully. In mock engagements against Spitfires and Hurricanes, the pattern repeated with mechanical consistency. In level flight, the margins were narrow. In climbs, advantages shifted by altitude. But once the nose pointed down, the German fighter owned the vertical. The realization carried strategic weight. This was not simply a better aircraft, it represented a different philosophy of air combat. Hit hard. Escape fast. Choose when to fight and when to leave. Air Ministry officials reviewed the findings in quiet rooms, poring over graphs and pilot reports. The implications reached far beyond tactics. If German fighters could disengage at will, then bomber escorts were vulnerable. Offensive sweeps over occupied Europe would bleed pilots faster than they could be replaced, and yet, beneath the concern, another thought began to form. If this advantage was now understood, measured, quantified, proven, then it could be countered, but that answer did not lie in theory. It would come only when Allied pilots met the FW-190 again, in combat, armed with knowledge that had arrived just in time, or perhaps already too late. The next encounters unfolded not in laboratories, but in the thin air over occupied Europe, where theory was tested by fear, gravity, and seconds that vanished without warning. RAF pilots were briefed carefully. Not with reassurance, but with limits. Do not follow the FW-190 straight down. Do not accept its terms. Keep altitude. Keep speed. Fight in pairs. Every instruction carried the weight of men already lost for ignoring them. Then the radios crackled over northern France, contrails twisted against pale blue sky as Spitfire squadrons crossed the coast. Engines strained at combat power. Oxygen masks hissed softly in cockpits already slick with sweat. Pilots scanned constantly, above, below, behind. Knowing the FW-190 rarely announced itself, the first sighting often came as a blur. A dark shape slicing across the sun. A sudden hammering of cannon fire. The FW-190 did not circle. It struck once, violently, then pitched downward at an angle that felt almost reckless. Instinct screamed to follow, hands tightened on control columns. The nose dipped. Airspeed climbed fast. The wind rose to a roar, vibrating through the airframe. But the warnings from Farnborough echoed louder. Spitfire wings shuddered as compressibility effects crept in. Controls stiffened. The aircraft felt heavy, unwilling, like it was pushing back against the pilot's will. Below, the German fighter did not hesitate. The FW-190 dropped cleanly into the vertical, accelerating with frightening ease. Its broad wings stayed steady. The aircraft neither trembled nor wandered. At speeds where Allied fighters began to lose authority, it remained composed, almost casual. As it tore away toward the earth, pilots pulled up hard, forced to abandon pursuit. In those moments, the gap widened brutally. The enemy aircraft shrank, then vanished entirely, leaving behind nothing but empty sky and unanswered frustration. In other engagements, when Spitfires managed to keep altitude discipline, the fight changed. Attacks were brief, coordinated. German fighters that tried to dive too early sometimes exposed themselves to crossfire. The lessons from the captured aircraft began to matter, but only when discipline held under pressure. Still, the margin for error was razor-thin. Combat reports described the same paradox. The FW-190 was not invincible. It could be hit. It could be damaged. But if the pilot chose to disengage, gravity became his ally, and speed his shield. Every encounter reinforced the same truth: the battle was no longer just horizontal. It was vertical. Whoever controlled the dive controlled survival. As squadrons landed and pilots climbed stiffly from cockpits, the tension followed them to the ground. They now understood why the German fighter escaped so often. They understood how it was done, but understanding alone did not stop losses. The real question remained: could the Allies change fast enough, in aircraft and doctrine, before the FW-190's advantage carved the sky permanently against them? The impact spread outward from the cockpit to the entire air war fighter command. Statistics began to reflect what pilots already felt in their bones. Engagements against FW-190-equipped units were shorter, harsher, and less forgiving. Losses did not always come from prolonged dogfights, but from sudden, violent passes that left no time to react. A single burst of 20mm cannon fire, then the German fighter was gone, already diving, already safe. Tactically, the Luftwaffe had gained initiative. FW-190 units could choose when to fight and when to disengage. This forced Allied formations into defensive postures even during offensive sweeps. Escort fighters had to stay tighter to bombers, reducing flexibility. Chasing kills became a liability rather than a goal. At squadron level, doctrine shifted under pressure. Pilots were drilled to fight the aircraft, not the instinct. Attacks were planned from above and behind. Vertical separation became survival. Dive pursuit was forbidden unless conditions were perfect. These changes saved lives, but they also limited aggression, and aggression had once been the RAF's advantage. The consequences reached into aircraft production lines. The Spitfire Mkv, once dominant, was now clearly outmatched at low and medium altitudes. Reports from Farnborough and frontline units aligned with brutal clarity. The answer would not come from tactics alone. Urgent emphasis was placed on new variants. The Spitfire Mk9, fitted with the Merlin 61 engine, was rushed into service specifically to counter the FW-190. Higher climb rates. Better high-altitude performance. A chance to regain the vertical advantage that had been lost. Every delay meant more pilots facing an aircraft they could not safely pursue. Meanwhile, German confidence grew. Luftwaffe pilots trusted their machines. Memoirs and combat reports describe dives taken without hesitation, knowing the aircraft would hold together and the controls would answer. That confidence translated directly into combat effectiveness. A pilot who knows he can escape fights differently, but the advantage carried its own risks. As Allied pilots adapted, German tactics became predictable. The dive was powerful, but it was also a commitment. A mistimed disengagement could place an FW-190 low, fast, and isolated. Over France, Allied pilots began coordinating traps, using altitude layers and mutual support to punish fighters that broke formation too early. The sky became a place of calculation rather than instinct. Maps changed. Arrows shifted. Commanders on both sides understood the stakes. This was no longer about individual aircraft, it was about whether the Allies could regain initiative before the air war tilted irreversibly. By late 1942, the margin had narrowed. The dive was still lethal. Still terrifying. But it was no longer mysterious, and as new Allied fighters began to arrive on forward airfields, one final test loomed: whether knowledge, speed, and discipline could finally strip the FW-190 of the advantage that had once made it untouchable. The balance did change, but not suddenly, and not without cost. By early 1943, the lessons learned from the captured FW-190 had fully reshaped Allied air doctrine. The aircraft was no longer an enigma. Its strengths were understood precisely. Its weaknesses, though narrow, were real. The dive that once guaranteed escape was now treated as a predictable maneuver rather than a magic trick. The arrival of improved Allied fighters mattered enormously. The Spitfire Mk9 restored parity at critical altitudes, allowing pilots to stay with the fight longer and regain vertical control. American fighters entering the theater, most notably later model P-47s and P-51s, were designed with high-speed dives in mind, built to follow without surrendering control. The physics of combat had not changed. The machines had. German pilots noticed the difference immediately. Combat reports reflect growing caution. Dives were still used, but no longer assumed to be safe by default. Allied fighters sometimes stayed with them. Sometimes they closed the gap. Sometimes the escape failed. The FW-190 remained a formidable aircraft. Its rugged construction, heavy armament, and roll rate ensured it continued to exact a toll. But its greatest advantage, the ability to disengage at will, had been blunted by understanding. The moment Allied pilots stopped chasing blindly and started fighting the geometry of the sky, the aircraft lost its psychological edge. At Farnborough, the captured FW-190 had long since been catalogued, measured, and preserved. Its legacy, however, lived on in pilot training manuals, tactical briefings, and engineering priorities. It forced the Allies to confront an uncomfortable truth: superiority was never permanent. It had to be maintained, questioned, and rebuilt. For the pilots who faced it in 1941 and 1942, that knowledge came too late. Many never returned to explain what they had seen. For those who followed, it became survival. The story of the FW-190's dive is not just about speed or engineering brilliance. It is about how war punishes complacency. How a single design choice, strong wings, responsive controls, a durable engine, can shift an entire battlefield until someone is willing to stop guessing and start learning. Modern air combat doctrine still carries that lesson. Understand the enemy's strengths. Respect them. Measure them. And never assume that what worked yesterday will work tomorrow. On that windswept Welsh airfield in 1942, Allied pilots stood around a captured machine and felt disbelief. But disbelief gave way to clarity. And clarity, paid for in time and lives, helped turn the sky back into contested ground, where no aircraft, no matter how fast it could dive, remained untouchable.